Now, this, of course, is complicated because when we talk about the founders, we're often specifically thinking about the founders of 1787, and their democratic credentials in a modern context seem a little troubling, not exactly the same as what we would want to embrace today. And I think, of course, that's entirely true. So, but generally speaking, when I think about this from a broader theoretical perspective, is why should we interpret and apply constitutional rules drafted by one set of actors and apply them against another set of actors? That, I think, is not necessarily specifically grounded in the details of electoral mechanisms of the 1780s, but rather trying to think about what authorizes one set of lawgivers to trump other set of lawgivers. And the argument, I think, ultimately turns on the kinds of democratic credentials that we think is possessed by the more authoritative lawgivers. Now, that's not obvious, not only from this perspective of thinking about very old documents like the Constitution that we happen to have for the United States, but even thinking more generally, why should we take the credentials of one set of lawgivers as being superior to a different set of lawgivers? So Noah Webster, for example, early in the nation's history, questioned whether or not there was an important difference between a popular assembly that we call a legislature and a popular assembly that we call a constitutional convention. At the end of the day, we're electing a bunch of representatives that are making laws, and that's true for both legislatures and conventions. So as a consequence, there's no particular significance about whether we call those assemblies legislatures or conventions, and we shouldn't then think that one that's prior in time ought to necessarily then trump the kinds of decisions that are being made by one later in time. So I think there's an interesting challenge then, and we see sort of echoes of these kinds of arguments as well appearing in people like Jeremy Waldron's concern that we ought to abandon judicial review entirely. And why should we abandon judicial review? Because we shouldn't entrench constitutional rules and regard them as particularly authoritative against later democratic decision makers, right? So from his perspective as well, he would argue that fundamentally there's no difference between what we would call a constitutional convention and what we would call a later legislature, except the later legislature is later in time, and therefore, generally speaking, we ought to take it as more authoritative rather than less authoritative than the earlier convention. Now, here I would refer in part simply to our normal thinking. While it is true that from a matter of first principles, there are interesting questions about why we ought to take constitutional conventions as particularly authoritative, at least within this political culture and this particular legal system, we do recognize that there's a distinction between conventions and legislatures, and we recognize that within a legal hierarchy, these things that we call conventions are publicly understood to have greater authority than these things that we call legislatures, just like we think that certain kinds of administrative agencies have lesser authority than legislative bodies as well, and we could do it differently, and maybe there's